Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspective on various issues of the day. And I'm joined as I am every week by my co-host Richard Ebeing, who teaches economics at the Citadel and who I think is still on vacation, right, Richard?
Well, for a few more days. The new semester begins at the Citadel next week, so I'm getting prepared for my classes and to once more try to influence with sound reasoning the young minds that will be in my care.
Yeah, you professors are kind of like on vacation 12 months out of the year. You got these cush jobs, get in there and just give a few lectures. Doesn't really take much work, does it?
Now, viewers and listeners, do you see what I have to put up with? Now, I've been nice. It's now for 3 decades. I have taken this abuse, misunderstanding, characterizations, but I'm big enough, you see, to continue to do this. Well, it's about as much work as just sitting around at a computer and just doing these little things every day about what's wrong with government.
You mean the ivory tower work that we're engaged in, advancing liberty? All right, Richard, we've been discussing socialism. We're going to continue our series. We got all the way up to the Franklin Roosevelt New Deal era, where we talked about Social Security, which was really the first welfare state program that came into existence. A socialist program, as we discussed. It originated among German socialists. It got imported into the United States, and it ultimately became really the crown jewel of the entire socialist welfare state system in America. And we can discuss the various socialist programs that came out of that initial program. But I thought maybe what we ought to do next, though, is examine a socialist program that many Americans don't view as a socialist program. But certainly the Libertarian prize-winning economist Milton Friedman brought this up many, many years ago. And that is what happened to the United States after World War II. And that was the period, of course, where the federal government got converted from what was a limited government republic type of governmental system that the Constitution had called into existence into what we know as a national security state, or a garrison state, a military state that consists of the Pentagon, a massive military-industrial complex, as President Eisenhower would call it later on in the early 1960s, the CIA, the NSA. We don't commonly think of these as a socialist structure because it's part of what we call the warfare state side of the federal government as compared to the welfare state side. But as Milton Friedman pointed out many years ago in an essay, the military structure, the entire military intelligence establishment, the national security state, really is the premier example of a socialist structure. It certainly has all the components of a socialist structure, like central planning. I mean, you couldn't find a better example of central planning than the military. You've got this hierarchy where commands and directives start out at the top and they come down, as compared to a free market private property order where entrepreneurs are coming up with ideas at the bottom and percolating upward. This is a total command and control system that starts at the top. It's funded by the coercive apparatus of taxation. Everything's run by the government, and you of course have all the inefficiencies. We know about all the $1,000 hammers and stuff that they use, but we also see it in a much larger sense. I mean, I don't think you would ever find a greater waste of money. I mean, old Reagan's mantra of waste, fraud, and abuse than in the military, and because this is really what happens with socialist programs. They're highly inefficient. They're usually riddled with crookedness and corruption and so forth. We can't avoid the fact that this really did fundamentally alter not only the governmental structure of America, but also our society. that the national security state really is the dominant factor in American life. It controls what goes on overseas with all this foreign interventionism, what's going on in Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria and Iran, and also the blowback, the consequences of all this interventionism here at home, where the military and the CIA and the NSA really wield totalitarian powers over the American people. You know, we see them assassinating people overseas, but it's easy to forget that they have that same power of assassination here and domestically, fully upheld by the federal judiciary. That anybody that poses a threat to national security or is considered a terrorist, they have the authority to assassinate them, along with putting people into military dungeons and detention centers, indefinite detention, torture, including of Americans. They fundamentally have altered the American structure because of this command and control garrison national security state. So what do you think, Richard?
Well, I think that we need to remember that all of this emerged out of the Roosevelt administration, and particularly during the Second World War. The Second World War is the sort of the catalyst for all of this. America fought in the First World War under this messianic urge of Woodrow Wilson to make the world safe for democracy, seeing himself as the great global peacemaker and whatnot. And there are many aspects of the Wilson administration that have marks of the collectivist society. The centralizing of economic activity during the year and a half during which we participated in that war, the censoring of the media, the arresting of political opponents, the use of mass propaganda. But all of that pales, though it was an inspiration for Roosevelt and those around him, because after all, Roosevelt was the Undersecretary of the Navy during the First World War. But all of that pales in significance in terms of magnitude, impact, extensiveness, compared to what was begun during the Second World War. Here we saw a huge propaganda campaign, the emergence of what became the CIA, the old OSS during the Second World War, the idea of the building of a Pentagon, that is this huge infrastructure of a military just to win the war and then expected to have a leading place in American domestic and foreign affairs long after that. This notion that America, with the New Deal, was not just attempting to remold American society at home, but now the mission of the U.S. government was to be a permanent and the most prominent player on the global scene to socially engineer the future of the world. Maybe a lot of our viewers and listeners aren't familiar with the fact, Jacob, that back in 1995, you and I co-authored and co-edited, along with other contributors, a volume called The Failure of America's Foreign Wars. And not only, but a good number of those essays and articles in the book focused on themes and aspects of the Second World War. And one that I wrote, which was a lengthy piece on the wartime conferences, and particularly the Yalta Conference of February 1945, between Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, was that Roosevelt viewed himself, along with these two partners, reshaping the political, the social, the cultural, the economic fate of the world, and that they would be the central planners in some type of conjunction with each other. And that has been the mindset ever since of the U.S. government. If you want to think about this, is that the United States decided that, having defeated Nazi Germany and Stalin's obstinance in not being willing to be a junior partner in an American global policing of the planet, because he himself had his own global communist and Marxist designs in becoming the supreme master of the world for the purposes of communism. America now takes over this mantle and sets up NATO shortly after the end of the war, 1949. Institutes global foreign aid programs, of which the Marshall Plan was sort of a premier example, as well as aid to Greece and so on, that all became the models for this idea of America through its political power, its military power, and its economic power derived from taxing, to be able to try to reshape the fate of the world. Now, essential to this were these agencies: the National Security Agency, the building up of the Pentagon, the permanent institutionalization of the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, and this idea that now, in the name of having defeated the Nazis, now to fight a global Cold War against communism, the United States government would have to do things that would have been considered shocking in the past. Now, I think it was Henry Stimson who, when he was Secretary of State under Herbert Hoover, there had been people in the State Department and then the sort of rudiment security agencies that wanted to intercept and read the mail coming in and out of a number of foreign embassies in Washington, D.C. And if I remember the story correctly, Stimson said that this was not to be done because a gentleman does not read another gentleman's mail. Now, who would even think of this today, Jacob? The idea the United States now with technology can follow every keystroke on our laptops, can intercept every email that we send or receive, can eavesdrop on our cell phone and landline conversations. In fact, they have absolute intrusiveness and control over everything we do. And this is all meant to be part of the planning of policing the world, intervening in other countries, bribing other governments with taxpayer money, influencing the directions that they follow through military aid and in many instances, direct, indirect, explicit and implicit intervention in their internal affairs. And then there's one other element of this, and that is the economic role of this warfare state. Now, maybe a lot of the viewers and listeners do not remember or have ever heard of a conservative writer named Felix Morley. He was extremely well known in conservative and classical liberal libertarian circles in the 1940s and 50s and into the 60s. He has an excellent book from 1949 called Power and the People, which is a defense of American exceptionalism of individual freedom and constitutional government. But in 1958, he wrote the lead article for the first issue of the Conservatives' quarterly Modern Age. And this lead article, that first issue, was called American Republic or American Empire. And what Felix Morley did in this article, Jacob, is to say that there was this traditional notion of America minding its own business, conserving and preserving freedom at home by respecting the constitutional restraints on government and not intruding into other people's affairs and other lands, other than if the United States, as constitutionally required, come to the defense of the nation in an act of self-defense if we were aggressed against or invaded. Now, what he says is that the post-Cold War mentality transformed this. And an ingredient, he explained this, is that you had Cold War Keynesianism. With the growth of the Pentagon and military spending, this became a major ingredient of government's fiscal policy power in influencing spending, employment, taxing, to all sort of act as one of the pump primers to use the military side of the budget to do Keynesian aggregate demand management. And through this, a vast array of special interest groups had been created, Jacob, whose now market shares and profit margins were heavily dependent upon the continuation of this military spending and the rationales and justification of it, that there are always enemies abroad that justify the need for this military spending, and therefore the procurements through which these sectors of the U.S. economy gain a large part of their revenues and ability to remain profitable outside of and independent of the market economy, where private individuals are demanding goods and private businessmen supply them through competitive processes of making the better mousetrap. So in fact, what Morley was saying already in 1958 was something that has remained true. That there are many segments of the U.S. economy, both inside the government and outside of the government, who are dependent upon the continual finding of monsters abroad to justify the spendings upon which their bureaucratic and private sector rice bowls are dependent. And this is as much a vested special interest spider's web as conservatives and libertarians usually refer to at the domestic side. Oh, those who live off domestic government spending, welfare payments, government contracts, deficit spending, subsidies to farmers, special favors to these private businessmen, crony capitalism. Well, what is true domestically, Jacob, is no less true in the government spendings involving foreign policy. The only, an important difference, however, between the domestic spending and the foreign spending is that rarely does domestic spending involve dropping bombs on either Americans or foreigners. But that is inseparable from America's foreign policy interventionism. Invariably, the interventions involve the United States consciously or unintendedly being sucked in to conflicts, disputes, civil wars, and revolutions in other parts of the world, which means the United States therefore puts its own citizens in harm's way, unjustifiably having nothing to do with the legitimate notion of national defense, and brings death and destruction to multitudes of others purely because America tries to put its finger on the scales to determine the balance of outcomes in countries in other parts of the world that the Washington establishment decides is part of the agenda to make the world safe for, well, the establishment.
Yeah, you bring up lots of excellent points. While you were talking, I was reminded of the essay that William Graham Sumner wrote after the Spanish-American War, The Conquest of the United States by Spain. And his point was that even though the United States had defeated Spain in the Spanish-American War, that Spain had actually won because the United States had ended up adopting all of the mindset and policies and philosophy of the Spanish Empire. In fact, the U.S. had just stepped in the shoes of the Spanish Empire. They had falsely represented to the Filipinos and to the Cubans that they were helping them fight for their independence, but in fact they were helping them fight so that they could become colonies or subjects of the U.S. empire. And this was the start of the trend. You had in the late 1800s, you had the progressive movement moving America away from a free market society toward a socialist society, a welfare state society, and we've talked about that. But you also had this movement that was moving America toward the direction of empire and foreign intervention happening at the exact same time. And so this is how the United States acquires Guantanamo Bay. Guam takes effectively total control over Cuba. It's how we got Puerto Rico. So it was this mindset that America cannot be a great nation unless it's an empire, like the British Empire and the Spanish Empire with colonies and so forth. And then that movement toward interventionism starts gaining ground with World War I, which was a total disaster. Didn't achieve anything. It just sacrificed tens of thousands of American men for nothing, because that then laid the framework with the Treaty of Versailles. And the vindictive provisions there, it set the foundation for World War II and the rise of Adolf Hitler. And so here was this irony that the U.S. defeats Hitler, and U.S. officials say to the American people, well, okay, you've just made this huge sacrifice to stop Nazi Germany, but we got bad news for you. You cannot rest. We now face this implacable foe of the Soviet Union and godless communism that is arguably even worse than Nazism and Nazi Germany. And so now we have to convert the federal government to this national security state form of governmental structure, which I consider the worst mistake in U.S. history. Because it so fundamentally transformed our governmental system as well as transformed our society. And what was interesting also was that they did it without a constitutional amendment. I mean, we live under a constitutional order where if you're going to change something radically in society with respect to the governmental structure, there's a process for doing that. It's called the amendment process. So like when they wanted to, alter the government with respect to prohibition, they had to go through a constitutional amendment. Well, that's exactly what they should have done, because this was a revolutionary transformation of the American governmental system. And they just did it essentially by fiat, by announcing that we face this foe of the Soviet Union. And their idea was that the Soviet Union and its communist regime wasn't bound by any constitutional restrictions. They could go out and exercise omnipotent power, assassinations, coups, invasions, and so forth, and that America would not be able to prevail in this new Cold War with its hands tied behind its back with constitutional restraints. So they felt, well, we need to alter the form of governmental structure to essentially match that of the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union was a national security state. North Korea today is a national security state. Cuba is a national security state. A national security state is inherent to a totalitarian regime. So you've got these agencies which are now adopting policies and practices and powers that were no part of the original governmental structure. The CIA acquires the power to assassinate people from the very beginning. I mean, that's where they conspire to assassinate Patrice Lumumba. Then there's also the coups, like in Iran in 1953, where they oust the democratically elected prime minister of the country, Mohammad Mossadegh, and install the Shah of Iran, and then helped him bring into existence this powerful, omnipotent, totalitarian tyranny. That's why the Iranians end up revolting against this U.S. tyrant in 1979. You've got this massive military structure that now not only has colonies and bases in Cuba and the Philippines, but now is expanding all over the world with really amounts to an empire of bases. Along with the interventions, you got the intervention in Korea, and then Vietnam, and then, of course, all the modern-day interventions, the big ones, Iraq, Afghanistan, the smaller ones, Syria, and Panama, and Chile. And I mean, it was just a fundamental transformation of American life that ended up really destroying our freedom here at home. I mean, how can anyone honestly say that they live in a free society when their very own government has the authority to kill them legally by simply labeling them a terrorist, or rounding them up and putting them in a detention center or in a military dungeon just by saying they're a terrorist, or torturing them? I mean, we now live under a regime where the government, it has the authority not just to torture foreigners, but to torture Americans too. And that's been confirmed by the federal courts too, and that was another interesting phenomenon about this, that as this transformation was taking place, the federal courts went silent or passive, where they just deferred to this new power structure. Let me wrap up this part of the show by referring people to a book called Double Government by a man named Michael Glennon, who's a professor of law at Tufts University. This is a stout guy academically. He also served as a lawyer for some committees in Congress. The thesis of his book is that this arm of the government, the NSA, the Pentagon, and the CIA, all of whom have their offices outside Washington, in Virginia and Maryland, sort of like overlooking Washington, that's where the real power structure in America now is. And that while the federal judiciary, the Supreme Court, the presidency, and the Congress ostensibly have the power, that it's only because the national security branch of the government is permitting them the veneer of power. But that everybody in Washington knows where the real power is, and that's with the national security branch of the government, because that's where the force is. We all know as libertarians that government is force. And when you've got this massive structure of force, the military establishment, the intelligence establishment that has the power to assassinate people with impunity, without judicial review, massive surveillance schemes, that's where the real power of government is going to lie. And that's the real danger. This is what Eisenhower was talking about in his farewell address in '61, where he said that this new way of life, and he described it as new way of life, he called it a military-industrial complex, but it poses a grave threat to the liberties and democratic processes of the people. And we see this in every other country where they've been converted to a national security state, that people lose their liberty. And there's no way to reconcile these omnipotent powers that this structure has with the principles of a free society. The only way to get a restoration of those principles of liberty is by restoring a limited government republic to our land, which is our heritage. That's what was given to us by the Constitution.
I think also part of this is that people lose memories, sometimes because a generation passes, of aspects of freedom that have been lost that they don't even are aware of. In my December article for FFF's monthly publication, Future of Freedom, I have a piece about, appreciating the freedoms that we lose. And I use a few examples, so if you'll permit me to just quickly reiterate them here, Jacob. I point out that I'm old enough to remember that you could go into an airport and go through none of these security checks. You didn't have metal detectors of any note. You didn't have X-ray machines. You didn't have pat-downs. You were not restricted to going no further as a non-passenger to where the security machinery and checks are. You could go to the gate and welcome someone who was arriving. You could accompany someone to the gate to wish them farewell as they were flying away. You could often, in many airports, go to the roofs of the main building and, using a coin-operated telescope, proceed to watch the planes land and people coming off the planes if they got off on the tarmac. All of that is gone, and people take for granted. You take off your shoes, they can go through your bags, they can strip search you, they have a rationale or justification to do so in their minds. All of that is gone. I also mentioned another example, which I suggest in the piece that probably most Americans aren't aware of, but there is a town on the Vermont-Canadian border where there is a library and an opera house right along the borderline. It straddles the borderline. And this was built as a private philanthropic endeavor around 1904, 1906. I have the date in the article. And it was meant to show the brotherhood and peaceful collaborative world of Americans with their northern Canadian neighbors, where the library, the border of the library line is in the middle of the library with two entrances on the Canadian and the American side. And would just come in and check out a library book. And the accompanying adjacent opera house is the same. The borderline runs through the orchestra seats. And who cared? You went in and you just watched the performance. Guess what happened after 9/11? Okay, guess what happened after 9/11? Oh, you don't know who's coming across the border or what nefarious purpose they have. So Americans can still enter this library on the border with Canada and just, rummage through and look for a book to check out or read a magazine. But the Canadians, now, they have to go through security checks and lamps at night. And it used to be the case that the border was basically open, so Canadians might work in the United States and go home at the end of the workday. Americans might work on the American side, but then have their home on the Canadian side for whatever reason that they bought their home there, a nicer home, more convenient, whatever. And it was as if the border more or less did not exist in this community. Well, now you can't do that. Canadians have to stay over there unless they can prove that they're not some weirdo terrorist commie pinko threatening, the existence of America, because obviously those Canadians might just hate us for who we are. And all of these are and I give some more examples, but they sound trivial, but they're not. Because, it's sort of like if you stare at the clock, you hardly notice that the hands move. But look at the clock. Oh, it's 12:15, and you're busy doing things, and you look up. Oh my God, it's already 1:45. How did a half an hour go by so quickly? Okay, drip by drip, a little bit of these freedoms are taken away from us, Jacob. The ability to enter and exit an airport, the ability to use a library, the ability to feel safe and secure. Think of the different attitude between when the Pentagon Papers were first publicized during the Vietnam War and published in the New York Times, and now WikiLeaks. When the Pentagon Papers were made available to the New York Times by a whistleblower, And the government tried to squelch this and threatened to do bad things to the New York Times. There was an uproar in the media and public opinion by many, since the war was so divisive in American society. The people have a right to know. They shouldn't be able to keep secrets. We should know the blunderings and stupidities that have guided this war, that have put us in this situation that we're now in. But what's the situation with WikiLeaks? Oh my gosh, this organizer and head of WikiLeaks, treasonous. He should be locked up. Maybe he should be executed. What? He released documents. What? It included maybe some emails by politicians and bureaucrats about how the government is fighting these wars in the Middle East. Oh no! Oh no! This man is clearly un-American. I mean, that itself is a change in the mindset. Now, were there people who, during the Vietnam War, supported the war and believed that, these are wartime secrets? Yes, of course. There's always going to be differences of opinion like this. But there was a large segment of the U.S. population in general, as well as among the media, intellectuals, even some policymakers, who believed that the war had been a disaster and it was done surreptitiously, and there was the full sense that you could centrally plan a conflict 10,000 miles away. This should be known to the American people. Where's the outcry? Where's the demand that this man be set free and not be threatened with life imprisonment in a dungeon somewhere, merely because what? He's attempted to let the American, and in fact the world population, know the nefarious and confused and sometimes illegal ways the U.S. government has gone about its affairs. This is too shocking. That itself shows the change in attitudes and mindsets between now and about half a century ago.
That's a great point. I mean, they fundamentally transformed American society, and they wanted to keep everything secret. That was the exchange, that give us the power to do some dark side things and we will keep you safe, but don't ask us what we're doing. And if anybody discloses what we're doing, he's going to be considered a traitor, a bad person for disclosing these sordid dark side practices like assassination and so forth. I mean, let's assume that the CIA was conspiring to, say, assassinate Fidel Castro, and somebody discloses it as a whistleblower and says, hey, there's an assassination attempt. He would be condemned as a bad person for disclosing the assassination attempt, even though this was a clear case of murder, because that's what assassination is. And your point about the normality of American society growing up, I mean, is so accurate. I mean, there was this big fear that was engendered in all of us that the Russians were coming, that the communists were in the State Department in Hollywood, and everybody, the communists were going to take over. So there was that fear, but there was no fear of terrorism, and we didn't worry when you got into a plane that the terrorists were going to hijack the plane. There was a sense of normality to American society, all of which changes when they lose their official Cold War enemy with the end of the Cold War, the Soviet Union. Berlin Wall comes down, the Warsaw Pact gets dismantled. They were scrambling for new official enemies, because in every national security state, they have to have fear. That's the coin of the realm in a national security state. So they go into the Middle East even more than they had been before. They start, Persian Gulf intervention, sanctions against Iraq that were killing hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children, the unconditional support for the Israeli government, the stationing of troops near Islamic Holy Lands. All of this predictably brings up terrorist blowback, the retaliation. You've got the 93 attack on the World Trade Center, which was no different in principle from the 9/11 attacks, the attack on the USS Cole, the attacks on the U.S. embassies in East Africa, the 9/11 attacks, the Fort Hood attack, the Detroit would-be attack. I mean, it goes on. And it's their interventionism that produced the danger of terrorist retaliation that then caused them to put everybody at the airports and really take away our liberty. I mean, even when you're returning from overseas now from vacation or a business trip, they can take your cell phone and do a complete search and force you to hand over your password. So they do a complete search of your cell phone, all your private things in there, because you might be a terrorist. Well, the important thing here, Richard, is that it is possible to restore a society that is normally functioning, not a dysfunctional society we have today. And that's what is important for every American to realize, that it is possible to achieve that kind of society again, where going to the airports is normal, where security is placed in the hands of airlines instead of the government, where people are not living in constant fear that the terrorists are coming to get them. And that solution is simply to bring all the troops home from everywhere, stop them from killing anybody else, a non-interventionist foreign policy, which is our heritage as Americans. That was our original foreign policy, and dismantle the national security state that's responsible for all this dysfunctionality and restore a limited government republic to our land. If Americans were to do that, we would be a long way toward achieving a free, prosperous, peaceful, and harmonious society.
Yeah, I'll just add to that one has to appreciate the fact that at the end of the day, domestic policy and foreign policy are inseparably connected. It's often said, well, political disputes should end at the shores of the United States. No. Just as it is legitimate to oppose and criticize and challenge domestic interventionism and welfare redistributive statism, because it's a threat to, as classical liberals and libertarians, a threat to the liberty, the privacy, the property, the freedom of association, and therefore prosperity of the people of the country as a whole. The same applies in foreign affairs. It is the same mindset. People in Washington are to be the central planners of other people's destiny. Isn't that what they do in our domestic affairs? Redistributing our wealth, telling us the language we can use, how we can associate, the wages we can pay people, how we can run our business. Do they not at the same time use the wealth of Americans to try to remake and remold other societies the same way they try to do that with Americans through public education at home? The parallels and the analogies are almost one-to-one in how the government operates in its domestic affairs and its foreign affairs, in terms of the mindset of the central plan, the social engineer. The only difference, as you were highlighting, is the fact that rarely does the United States drop bombs on Americans at home for doing things that the U.S. government doesn't like. They might arrest you, they might threaten you with trial and imprisonment, but rarely for evading your taxes do they nuke your house. But what do? They send drones to foreign countries, often without even the knowledge or permission of the foreign government in which this is being done, and they proceed to kill people with often collateral damage. What does that mean? Oh, there are other casualties than the particular person or persons we were intending to target. But you know what? You can't make an omelet without cracking a few collateral damage eggs. These are called human beings. But what's a word or a phrase? This is the reality of the United States government today. We are an empire. We straddle the world with men, resources, political and military influence, and power and pressure on other governments and their citizens. It is costly. It is damaging. It is eroding the quality of the American traditional principles of liberty and limited government. And if this continues, like all empires in the past, those policies will end up weakening and bringing down what had been the great experiment originally in freedom at home.
All right. On that excellent note, we'll wrap it up. I should say that we're about finished with compiling all of our end-of-year donations at the Future of Freedom Foundation. We had taken a week or more off at Christmas and New Year's, so it's going to take a little bit. It took a little bit to get everybody's letters out, but those of you that donated, you'll be receiving your letter shortly if you haven't already done so, and it'll reflect that your donation came in 2019, if that's when it was made. And I just want to tell you how appreciative we are for the great support that you give us and have given us. we couldn't do what we do without the great support you've given us. And it's just a big honor for me personally that y'all have supported us so generously over a 30-year period of time. And I will tell you that we will continue to do our very best to merit the confidence you've shown in us. So Richard, I greatly enjoyed the show and look forward to talking to you and continuing this series next week.
Until next time, thank you to the viewers and listeners for sharing their time with us.